In our last video, we learned about the structure and function of the neuron. In this video, we're going to take a look at how information is transmitted along the neuron. In other words, how an action potential works. To start, we need to be familiar with the concept of membrane potential. Membrane potential is simply the potential or stored energy of a neuron. And this stored energy can be measured in voltage. So the amount of potential energy in a neuron increases, then the voltage increases as well. And this voltage is caused by a difference in electrical charges inside and outside of the plasma membrane. Much like a battery has a negative and a positive end, the cell can be negative or positive inside compared to outside. And in general, the neuron is found in two states, either resting potential or action potential. Let's start by seeing what the neuron does when it is resting. So the resting potential is the voltage of a resting neuron. And to be clear, a resting neuron is not transmitting a signal. And we can describe the resting neuron as being polarized, negative inside and positive outside. Now note in this diagram, we're zooming in on just one part of the axon of a neuron. So here we can see the membrane inside negative compared to outside positive. And in general, the neuron's resting potential is about negative 70 millivolts. So what determines the resting potential? Well, transport proteins, and we've seen this in the past. So if we zoom in even further on the membrane, so here's the axon, here's the membrane of the axon, and now we're looking at just this little area right here in this diagram. One protein we see is the sodium-potassium pump. And because that's pumping 3 positive charges, 3 sodium ions outside, but only 2 potassium ions inside, that leads to more positive charges outside compared to inside, which makes the inside essentially a little bit negative. However, there's another key protein involved, and that is this leaky potassium channel right here. A leaky potassium channel is a channel that's always open. And since there's a high concentration of potassium inside the cell due to the pump, there's constantly potassium leaking outside by passive transport. And that increases the positive charges outside the membrane. There are some other proteins in the membrane though, and these are known as voltage-gated channels. These are not leaky. Sometimes they're closed and sometimes they're open. And what determines whether they're open or closed is voltage. So at a certain voltage, the gate to these channels will be closed. And at a different voltage, the gate to these channels might open. But at rest, the voltage-gated potassium and sodium ion channels are closed. So let's take a look at the neuron in action. In other words, the action potential. Action potential is just another word for the electrical signal that gets transmitted along the axon. And this is triggered by a stimulus. It could be physical touch, a light, sound, or a chemical. And what happens is that the membrane's permeability to ions changes. So let's look at that in more detail. And as we look, keep in mind that the action potential is always going to move one way, from the cell body along the axon towards the synaptic terminals. It is never going to reverse direction. So, as we are reviewing the next few slides, the only diagram you really need to draw is this. At the very end, you can make a note of the entire graph. So, in our first stage, the neuron is at rest. We can see the negative 70 millivolts, and the neuron is said to be polarized. And here we can see both of our gated channels are closed. The inside is negative, the outside is positive. However, if there is a stimulus in the environment, that's going to trigger the opening of a few sodium channels. So here, that stimulus caused the gate to open. And so now a little bit of sodium is going to enter into the neuron, which is going to make the inside a little bit less negative because now there's a few more positive charges. Now, if enough sodium channels open to reach a threshold, which is essentially negative 50, all right, if we get the charge inside to change from -70 to -50, then an action potential is triggered, and that's what happened right here. Now we see that there are many voltage-gated sodium channels open, and lots of sodium is entering the cell, making the inside of the cell very positive. All right, we are now in the positive area. At this point, the neuron is said to be depolarized. So positive means depolarized. However, once the action potential reaches its peak right here, that peak voltage is going to cause the sodium channels to close, so no more positive sodiums can enter. And meanwhile, those voltage-gated potassium channels open, and potassium leaves the cell. What this is going to do is start to restore the charge. So the inside is going to become negative again. And then here we see something called hyperpolarization. The potassium channels are a little bit slow to close, so the inside becomes more negative than -70. But then once those potassium channels close again, we have our resting potential restored. All right, negative inside, positive outside. And it would be a good idea to get this graph in. So to sum up the action potential, it's caused by depolarization of part of the axon as sodium and potassium channels open and close sequentially. And it's all or none event. The strength of the action potential is the same no matter how strong or weak the stimulus. So if you're cut by a knife versus cut by a pin, the reason why the knife hurts more is not because the action potential is stronger, but because there's more action potentials. And that concludes our exploration of the action potential.